Welcome back to another FPL video and podcast. This will be my transfer plans for Game Week 10, where I provide a review of how I did in Game Week 9 and then talk about my possible transfers, not just for the upcoming deadline, but also in the near future. And there are some possible different strategies for me and my setup, but I will finalize these plans in a couple of days' time with the team selection video once I have more information after the Carabao Cup games on Wednesday night, and also some press conferences on the Thursday and possibly the Friday as well. Smash the like button and subscribe if you're new. If you enjoy my content, our aim is to get this video to over 200 likes and to keep on pushing towards 35 subscribers and beyond. We hit 29k last week during the UCL Fantasy Deadline stream, so thank you very much for your support, and I'll be gifting 10 memberships in every single month. So just keep your eyes peeled with the live streams and you have a great chance of being gifted a membership for an entire month to gain access to my videos very early on, amongst many other perks. But without further ado, let's jump straight into it. When I wildcarded in Game Week 6, one of the things I said back then was I'll finally have a dependable goalkeeper because I started this campaign with Dean Henderson, but he's actually outscored David Raya in that time frame, and Arsenal have conceded 7 goals since Game Week 6 and even 9 since Game Week 5. Their last clean sheet in the Premier League was back in Game Week 4, and they kept several clean sheets in the early part of the season against the likes of Aston Villa and Tottenham away, but it just hasn't really materialised recently. They have kept clean sheets in the Champions League with 3 out of 3 and no goals conceded, of course, but they just haven't been able to translate that to the Premier League with all the injuries and also circumstances, particularly the red cards against Brighton, Man City and Bournemouth. Raya got booked against Liverpool and conceded twice to deliver 0 points overall, whilst Dean Henderson got an 8-pointer against Tottenham Hotspur. Admittedly, my defensive line is quite weak on paper. Mykolenko is a decent option at 4.3 million, and the fixtures remain excellent until Game Week 14, but straight afterwards, Everton have a period where they face Arsenal, Man City, Liverpool and Chelsea between Game Weeks 15 and 18, and you definitely want to avoid all Everton assets, particularly their defenders, in that time frame. But I think until then, Mykolenko can produce some returns, especially in fixtures like Southampton away in Game Week 10, but they haven't been as solid defensively as they have been in previous years under Sean Dyche. They've once again had a tough start to the season, but they got that point against Fulham after being outplayed. They probably should have lost that game, but Beto scored a late equaliser, and Mykolenko is still decent at 4.3 million. My second defender was Rico Lewis, the only one to produce a return with a clean sheet against Southampton in a 1-0 victory for Man City. Erling Haaland missed multiple big chances and City really should have been out of sight, but Southampton played some good football, and in terms of pass accuracy, over 90% at the Etihad is very impressive, and ultimately they stayed competitive in that game against one of the best teams in world football. Another start for Rico Lewis, and with Kyle Walker injured for the foreseeable future, you'd expect him to start against Bournemouth and Brighton, but don't count your chickens just yet, because I think Rico Lewis could still be benched in one of these matches coming up, especially with a Champions League game sandwiched in between, and I think rotation is inevitable with all Man City defenders, and that includes Rico Lewis, despite the recent injury situation. And last but definitely least would be my 4 million defender in Vandenberg, who got a 1-pointer against Ipswich Town, and Brentford went 2-0 down quite early on in the game. They made a great comeback towards the end, scoring in the 98th minute through Brian Mbeumo, who did a cross, but it somehow still went in. But Vandenberg has been terrible. Even in the Carabao Cup, they went through on penalties, but they conceded yet again against weak opposition on paper. I just don't trust Brentford defensively. Even over the next 4 game weeks where the fixtures look excellent, there is a fixture swing straight afterwards, a bit like with Everton, and that's where you definitely want to avoid all Brentford defenders, and the only ones I'd recommend would be Mbeumo in the midfield and Wissa up front. The midfield was rather mixed bag this week, but Cole Palmer scored his first goal since Game Week 6 with a 10-pointer, getting maximum bonus points in that 2-1 victory over Newcastle, and Cole Palmer seems essential. I don't think any player is, to be fair, and I said this back when Erling Haaland was scoring braces and hat-tricks every single game week, but there are certain players that are set and forget. Cole Palmer is definitely one of them, and I know some of you might prefer Mohamed Salah, but I'd actually rather go for Cole Palmer if I had to pick one of them. Ideally, you'd have both, but sometimes you have to make compromises and you can't have everybody you want, otherwise FPL would be too easy. My second midfielder is Phil Foden. I did sell Saka to Foden in Game Week 9. I used the orange flag as an excuse, coupled with the fixtures coming up. I thought City would score multiple goals against Southampton, and against the likes of Bournemouth and Brighton, Foden has done very well in the past against these teams, even last season, and I could see him getting a goal or two depending on the minutes, and that's going to be the biggest concern. But if he starts both games coming up, I think Foden will produce 1 or 2 goal contributions at the very least and kickstart his Premier League season. Let's now go on to the other midfielders. Morgan Rogers was one of them, only getting 1 point against Bournemouth, being subbed off quite early as well, which is a bit concerning, but Morgan Rogers has had a great start to this campaign with his overall performances. He's been a bit disappointing FPL-wise, but let's not forget, he's a 5.4 million midfielder, and if you have a lot of value tied up in him, you could definitely keep him despite these upcoming fixtures looking quite poor on paper, facing Tottenham and Liverpool away over the next 2, and even Chelsea away is on the horizon within the next 4 game weeks, but the likes of Rodgers and Ollie Watkins would definitely be viable to keep in the long term. And finally, the best of them all was Mbeumo with a 15-pointer. The nature of the returns was a bit fortuitous, but I'll take it nonetheless, and those that captain him did a very good job. It was a plum fixture on paper, and he managed to deliver the goods. Whether it's lucky or not, it's all about getting those points on board, and Mbeumo is the best mid-price midfielder in the game. On a more positive note, my forward line was exceptional in Game Week 9, with the exception of Dominic Solanke, who blanked once again, and that's now 3 game weeks where he's had no big chances, an XG figure of 0.1 in a 3-game period. That just isn't good enough. He looked completely toothless against West Ham and now Crystal Palace, but I always expected that game to be low scoring, so I'm not too surprised by this blank. But now with 2 home games against Aston Villa and Ipswich Town, I think Spurs attackers could come good in that period, but they're definitely sellable by Game Week 12, and I think Solanke is a sell. It's just a matter of timing. Do you do it now or in Game Week 12? But I certainly wouldn't advocate selling Solanke in Game Week 11. I think he'll return against Ipswich Town, that's for sure. And if he doesn't, and to be fair, it doesn't really matter what he does at that point, I think he's still a very easy sell against Man City at the Etihad. My second forward was Erling Haaland, who only scored 1 goal in that stadium against Southampton within the first 5 minutes, and it was looking good for those that triple captain him, but in the end, only a 6-pointer, a very underwhelming return for a triple captaincy score, but better than nothing. You got to take it and run, and I do think those that triple captain him were very unfortunate. He should have scored at least 2 goals, and if he had scored 3, I don't think anyone would have been complaining. In fact, his XGI figure was higher than when he got the hat-tricks against West Ham and Ipswich Town, and of course I triple captain him back in Game Week 2, so I count myself lucky with the triple captaincy chip. And finally, I think the best of them all was Chris Wood on Friday, who scored a brace against his former club, Leicester City. He has been a phenomenal asset so far this season, and by far my best pick since Game Week 1, in fact, and I'm really happy with his performances. I think it's an awkward time to buy him potentially. Facing West Ham and Ipswich Town over the next couple of weeks looks great, but he's also got Arsenal and Man City away within the next 5 game weeks, and I think Chris Wood is easily benchable in those scenarios. But given his recent form and Nottingham Forest's performances against the best clubs like Chelsea and Liverpool so far this season, you can't really count them out at the Emirates or the Etihad. You probably guessed it by now. I captained Erling Haaland. I firmly believed he was the best captaincy option in Game Week 9, and I think he should have scored more goals, and in the end 6 points is just not good enough against the worst team in the league. I got 65 points though, and that meant a small green arrow from around 1.6 million to 1.3. Not too shabby, but it's still nowhere near where I want to be. And by Game Week 3, I was around 266,000 in the world, and ever since I started making transfers over the international break in Game Week 4, it's all been downhill, and I wildcarded in Game Week 6, which definitely added a few more issues to my squad, especially the timing of the wildcard. If I'd waited at least 1 more week, I'd be in a much better position already, but we can't look to the past and only at the mistakes we made and trying to rectify them in the future. Palmer was my vice, and of course he ended up outscoring Erling Haaland. That's a common theme throughout most of my vice captaincies, and Phil Foden in for Saka did cost me 6 points. Otherwise, this would have been a substantial green arrow, and I possibly would have been in the top 1 million. But there's no time like the present, and I've got the ability to shape my future and do these free transfers to build the best possible squad, not just for Game Week 10, but also in the long term. Perhaps I'm being too stubborn here, but I firmly believe Arsenal will keep a clean sheet very soon, and it could be in the early kickoff against Newcastle. I think this will be a very low scoring game, and it was last year at St James's Park when Newcastle won by a scoreline of 1-0, and in the previous meeting it was a 2-0 victory for Arsenal in this same stadium. I think it's going to be a similar scoreline here, and I think Arsenal could sneak away a victory, especially if Gabriel and Saka and all these players are fit and available. Of course, we'll see what happens in the Preston North End game in the Carabao Cup, but I think Raya could come good eventually. He's still one of my favourite goalkeeper options in the entire game, but at this price tag, he has to deliver consistent clean sheets, and that hasn't been the case since Game Week 4. It's only a matter of time before I make a defender transfer, but I think I could go by Game Week 10 without making one with Rico Lewis away to Bournemouth. It's just a question of will he start, because if he does, I think Man City can win this game and keep a clean sheet. And you never know with Rico Lewis, he always has that potential to get an assist or some bonus points. We've seen that more often in UCL fantasy compared to FPL, but he's been fairly decent in this fantasy format with a few returns in the last couple of weeks, and most importantly of all, getting those consistent starts with Kyle Walker and Rodri out. I think with both players missing, that really opens the door for Rico Lewis to start most Premier League matches for Manchester City. But once Kyle Walker's back, that'll be a different story, so that's definitely one to monitor. The same goes for Gabriel and his injury, but we got a positive update by Mikel Arteta. I know a lot of you don't trust him, and I completely understand that, but he recently said, we are still assessing him. It doesn't look bad at all. He was much better than expected, so hopefully he'll be fine. He's had some tests, so that's a very positive update about Gabriel, and I personally think he will be available against Newcastle, so he goes from a sell to a hold in the Transits podcast I mentioned the other day, and that's all been quite clear, and I made the points there very concisely. So I think Gabriel is a great long-term option, but I think for those of you like myself with David Raya and Gabriel, there's still a temptation to sell one of them and diversify your defensive line, and I still prefer Trent Alexander-Arnold if you want to go for a premium defender, but I'm not so sure if I'd sell Gabriel to Gvardiol, Trent, or any defender at this moment in time. I still think Arsenal could keep a clean sheet here, and perhaps against Chelsea away, although that will be more difficult considering their form. Ultimately, I think Gabriel is a hold, but just wait and see if we get any further updates, because Arteta isn't the most reliable when it comes to press conferences and injury updates. The final defender in my starting 11 would be Mykolenko away to Southampton. I'm not entirely convinced about a clean sheet. I think both teams could score here, but I'm hoping for the best. Maybe Everton switch to a back five and go for Michael Keane, Branthwaite and Tarkowski. Especially if McNeil is out, there could be that formation change to solidify that defence and put in Dye up front with Dominic Calvert-Lewin. His minutes have been all over the place in the Premier League this season, but I'm still expecting great things from Phil Foden in the remainder of this campaign, and facing Bournemouth and Brighton, two opponents he scored against in recent meetings, particularly at their stadiums. I think Phil Foden has something up his sleeve. It's just a question of starting or not, just like with Rico Lewis, and I think that's really the only issue with most Man City assets. They've got the ability and the high ceiling, but can they get those consistent starts? Well, with De Bruyne out and the likes of Doku, Grealish and all these other players kind of struggling for fitness and experiencing recent injuries, I think Phil Foden has a great opportunity to cement a spot in that starting 11, but Kevin De Bruyne could be back imminently, and that could certainly change things, although last season they both coexisted in the starting 11 on many occasions, especially in the biggest games. The second midfielder would be Cole Palmer, by far the best option I've got in the attack, and that includes Erling Haaland. He faces Man United away, but with Erik ten Hag sacked, we could see a kind of small managerial bounce with Ruud van Nistelrooy being the interim, and of course they're looking to appoint the Portuguese manager from Sporting, and that could take some time according to recent reports, so we're not so sure if he's going to be in the dugout against Chelsea, but I'm still expecting a reaction from Man United, and it might not be as easy for Chelsea as you would have thought if Erik ten Hag had stayed in his job. The third midfielder though would be Morgan Rogers facing Tottenham away. I'm not too pleased with the fixture on paper, and also Morgan Rogers can be quite inconsistent, but he's got 2 goals in his last 3 away games in the Premier League, and he's been very good for me since I bought him on the Game Week 6 wildcard, and I can't really complain at this price tag. My favourite budget midfielder would be McNeil, but he's an injury doubt, and I'm not so sure if I'd make that sort of switch now, unless I knew for sure that McNeil would be available, and even then, that would only kind of serve me for like 4 or 5 game weeks, and afterwards, it might not really work to my favour. You've also got Buonanotte, who I really like the look of, and Garnacho, who technically isn't a budget midfielder. He's more of a mid-priced option. I think he'd be my favourite one if I had the money to stretch to him, and by selling Foden to Saka, I do actually have the funds to make that possible, and that's something I'll discuss very soon using websites like fpl.team. And finally, the best of them all, you could argue, apart from Cole Palmer, is Mbeumo facing Fulham away. He got a double-digit haul at Craven Cottage last season, but it's still quite a tough game for most teams. In fact, Fulham have a great home record since the beginning of the last season, and I think they could cause some problems to Brentford, but in the last 2 meetings, Brentford have actually kept 2 clean sheets and got a victory on board. As things stand, I'm leaning towards keeping Solanke for the next 2 game weeks and selling him around game week 12 when he faces Man City. But Aston Villa, as well as Ipswich Town at home, look very promising for Spurs attackers, especially game week 11. I think you could forgive Solanke for blank against Aston Villa if he then produces a double-digit haul against Ipswich Town. Based on what we've seen so far this season, that doesn't look too likely. He hasn't been great for bonus points, but I think we'll finally see him come good in one of these matches, and it could be Aston Villa, but more likely it will be that plum fixture against one of the worst defences in the Premier League. My second forward is Erling Haaland, but there is a case to sell him and then possibly spread the funds around, buy Mohamed Salah or Saka in the midfield, and then Trent Alexander-Arnold in the backline, whilst going for a mid-price forward like Jackson or possibly Ollie Watkins. I think having one of those two is definitely viable, because as much as going for Cunha, Wissa, and let's say another budget forward like Jimenez looks really good at the moment, I don't think that's ideal in terms of flexibility, and you definitely want a structure where it's easy to go back to Erling Haaland or an Ollie Watkins by going for that mid-price forward, and I could see myself making 2 changes in this forward line with Solanke and Haaland making way. But my final forward is someone I'm not looking to sell right now, and that's Chris Wood, despite the yellow flag. I covered his injury on Monday during the Transtips podcast with his exact quotes, and the same goes for the Nottingham Forest manager. They don't know much about the injury up until this point, but it doesn't seem serious, and it looks like he'll be fine for this weekend, and I'm very confident he will be available against West Ham and start that game. I think it's a case of holding him if you own Chris Wood, but for those looking to invest in a budget forward, I would definitely recommend Wissa and Cunha. Rolling the transfer this week would mean I'd have 3 available in game week 11, and possibly if I decide to hold my nerve and go into the international break with 4 free transfers, that could essentially act as a mini wildcard in a game week where a lot of people will be looking to use the chip if they haven't already. I think game week 12, 14, 16 and 18 are the best times to wildcard, but game week 12 might be my personal favourite. Multiple teams like Chelsea have a great fixture swing coming up, and I think it's a great time to wildcard for those that haven't deployed the chip up until this point. I've got Valdimarsson, Semenyo, Vandenberg and Greaves on my bench. My defensive line definitely needs an adjustment and improvement, and that's why Ait Nouri could be one of my transfers in, but he's on 4 yellow cards. 1 more before game week 19 means he'll be suspended for 1 Premier League match, so that will be a big concern. But if I've got Mikalenko, Gabriel if fit, and Rico Lewis, I think I could survive for now, and Jacob Greaves would be the defender making way. As discussed earlier, I would consider selling either Solanke or Haaland, perhaps even both in the coming weeks. And in the midfield, I could see myself going from Foden to Saka or Salah, and also upgrading somebody like Semenyo, especially if I sell Erling Haaland and have so much money available to really boost my 15-man squad in the best possible way. My current thinking with the captaincy is to go for Erling Haaland, but I'd be very tempted by Foden or Cole Palmer, so I could see myself changing the captaincy over the next few days, and I'll discuss this in the team selection and deadline stream. I think if you have Salah, he's the best captaincy option on paper, but football isn't always played that way, and sometimes there are some big surprises, and teams do adapt and improve based on recent games. For example, Brighton, if they play that high line against Liverpool, I could see Salah going ballistic, a bit like Cole Palmer did, maybe not to the same level, but maybe Brighton would have adjusted by then and be much more resolute than you'd expect. So by rolling in game week 10, I could be in a very strong position going into the next few weeks as we approach another international break, but that isn't set in stone, and there is still a possibility for me to use free transfers in game week 10, which I'm going to show you using fpl.team later on. But let's see what Drafthound are recommending with their algorithms and their suggested transfers, not just for game week 10, but also in the near future. If you haven't already, check out the link in the description below for Drafthound. Many of you have signed up using my link and talked about how useful this website is, and it's quite fun to use actually. Now, their transfer suggestions for my squad include Rodgers and Solanke out for Diaz and Danny Welbeck. Their second suggestion would be Rodgers and Haaland making way for Salah and Jackson. I think that looks like the best of all the ones they've mentioned, but to be fair, Greaves, Ait Nouri and Solanke to Jackson also looks really enticing. I think those 2 suggestions are actually even better than the top one at the moment, and they also say Gabriel and Solanke to Porro and Watkins, which are also decent. I'm not too fond of Gabriel to Porro. I think that would be a downgrade, but I think anybody over Solanke at this rate would be definitely a better option, although the timing is a bit off, and I think Ollie Watkins is more of a buy in game week 12 with some tough fixtures over the next 4 game weeks. And in terms of the optimization tool, they're recommending Semenyo and Gabriel in the starting 11, with Solanke and Van den Berg dropping to the bench, Haaland as the captain, and Palmer as the vice. They haven't really rated Solanke in the last couple of weeks, and I think Drafthound have been spot on about him, but going into Game Week 11, that's definitely the last chance saloon for Dominic Solanke, and he could do really well in that particular match. But you've got so many forwards like Chris Wood, Cunha, Wissa, and also Raul Jimenez, Delap, Strand Larsen, and not to mention Jackson and Watkins. I think all of them are the best forwards in the game alongside Erling Haaland, and changes will be made across all positions. Maybe I'll keep David Raya and kind of avoid goalkeeper transfers, but I could see defender transfers, midfield moves, and also forward changes coming up very soon. If I decide to pull the trigger this week and at least make 1 or 2 free transfers, the likely moves would be Aït-Nouri and Cunha for Solanke and Jacob Greaves, and I'd have 1.6 million left over as things stand. Of course, price changes over the next few days could definitely influence that, but David Raya in goal and the back three of Gabriel, Lewis and Aït-Nouri looks decent, especially with Mykolenko away to Southampton being on my bench. I've also got Mbeumo, Palmer, Foden and Rodgers, with Cunha, Haaland and Chris Wood up front, and an expected points figure of 55 with Haaland as the captain. Valdemarsson, Semenyo, Mykolenko and Van den Berg looks like a much stronger bench all of a sudden, but the midfield looks a bit lightweight, especially in Game Week 10 and possibly 11. I think Semenyo is still a decent choice to hold, and Morgan Rodgers is one of the best budget midfielders in the game. So if I decide to go for something like this and be aggressive, buying 2 Wolves assets against Crystal Palace and Southampton at home over the next 2 game weeks, I could then also buy Garnacho for one of my budget midfielders. Most likely Semenyo would make way, and I'd have a Man United attacker against Leicester, and also some really plum fixtures like Ipswich Town and Everton over the next 3 game weeks. That looks really promising, and with that new manager bounce potentially, I really like the look of these transfers being aggressive and bold, but it would mean no free transfers really, only 1 going into Game Week 12, and that doesn't really fill me with confidence, especially with another international break and plenty of fixture swings and even more transfers I might want to make by that stage. That could also include Erling Haaland making way and then spreading the funds to buy Mohamed Salah or Saka, getting him back once again. So as you can tell, there are pros and cons for being aggressive and using all the free transfers, and the same goes for rolling and assessing all my options in a couple of weeks. Ultimately, I'm going to have to decide, do I want to be aggressive or cautious? I might even find a middle ground and try not to really commit to one approach. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. What are you looking to do for Game Week 10 and beyond? And I'll dissect my updated transfer plans in the team selection as well as the deadline stream on Saturday. Thank you very much for watching this video and listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, then be sure to smash the like button and subscribe for new. Our aim is to get this video to over 200 likes and to keep on pushing towards 35 subscribers and beyond. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram, DylanRCM, and check all the other links in the description below for my Patreon and the championships for early access to my videos, amongst many other perks, the Discord server, FPL League, Drafthound, which I showed you very recently, as well as Spotify. Leave a 5-star review on my podcast and follow me on Spotify. It would go a long way to supporting my channel. I wish you all the best of luck for Game Week 10 and the rest of the season, and I'll see you next time.